Nice to see some old familiar faces. Oh, I shouldn't say old, some familiar faces. um, Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to come in. It was a pleasure to prepare for this. And Doug, I have to apologize to you. I initially indicated that I was going to look at two core ethics as adult learners. And as often happens with anything that I start touching, it evolves over time and becomes something that is tangentially related to what I initially thought I was going to talk about. And we have a little bit of a different talk. I'm going to do some reflecting today on some things that I've experienced over my time as a teacher and just as a human being. And we will get to that second core ethic, which is an action ethic, toward the end of my talk. One of the things that I uncovered that was a really strange and wonderful happenstance is that I didn't know that I didn't. How do I say this? I didn't know that I knew that my grandfather was a minister. I'm a preacher's grandkid. What I didn't know was that his last church was a UCC church on the Big Island of Hawaii. I discovered that this morning as I was just researching the history of your church. I was like, wait a second, this sounds like my grandfather. And I looked it up, and sure enough, my grandfather was a UCC minister back through the mid 80s. So anyway, somewhere he's looking down going, what the hell is my grandson doing? So anyway, I wanted to pose a couple of questions this morning, and they're not the questions that Doug introduced, but we'll wrap back around to those questions. The two questions that I want to pose, the first one is, I'm not sure how to do this. The first question I want to pose is this one around the arc of the moral universe being long but bending toward justice. It's a thing that you've probably heard it before. Martin Luther King used it in a number of his really famous addresses, but it actually goes back to Theodore Parker, who was a Unitarian minister back in the 1850s. And I want to explore that a little bit today. I also want to explore the idea of cultural change and shift. Sort of the inherited wisdom that we've received is that cultural change is a really slow and methodical process. And if you're someone who's interested in social justice, that idea of a slow process of change to bring about justice, it's something that we're easily impatient with when we're younger. And as we get older and we experience life more, I don't know if we become more patient, but we become more tolerant of injustices that we see around us. And I guess that's what I want to talk about today. So Doug said that I began my teaching career in LA. That's true. It was back in the early 1990s. And I was there in 1992. And 1992 there was a real inflection point for me as a human being in 1992, because that was the year of the LA uprisings. Some of you may not remember what the LA uprisings were, so I'm going to call it by the name that is more colloquial, and those are the Rodney King riots. I don't have a lot of you guys on screen, and I'm used to working with a room where I can see people. So can I get a couple thumbs up if you remember the LA riots, the Rodney King verdicts? So for those of you who don't remember, 1991, petty criminal Rodney King was surrounded by police officers in LA. An amateur videographer videoed a confrontation between Rodney King and I think it was 17 officers, and they beat him badly. And there's about 2 minutes of video. And living in LA and teaching in the inner city where most of my students were Black or brown, it was something we saw every day for a year. Over and over and over again, we witnessed that injustice. And it was a really difficult thing to watch. And, being young and idealistic, and my wife and I came to teaching sort of through a back door with a group called Teach for America. Both of us were motivated to try to give something back to our communities. We were really interested in social justice, and this was a way for us to be involved. Well, I can remember the day that the verdicts came out. I was late after school. It was maybe 4-ish, and I was in the office with my principal and with my office manager, both of whom were African American women, and we listened to the reading of the verdicts. And all 4 of the officers who were charged were found not guilty. And I can remember sitting there in shock with my principal. We had witnessed with our eyes over and over and over again on the evening news this horrible beating, and we couldn't understand how a jury could see the same material that we'd seen and come up with such a wrong seeming verdict. And as the 2 of us were sitting there going through our shock and dismay, I can remember the office manager looking up at me and saying, "Smith, you need to go home now." And my principal, Jackie Cochran, said, "Yeah, Nat, you probably ought to get in your car and drive home. It might not be safe for you to stay." So I got in my car and I drove and picked up my wife, who was at another school teaching, on my way home. And we went home. And by the time I got back to our house an hour later, things had broken out at Florence and Normandy. That was the corner where Reginald Denny was pulled from his vehicle and beaten, and shops began to be looted. And within a couple hours, there were fires set all over LA, and the world seemed to be coming apart. For 2 or 3 days, I sat with my 4 housemates, all of whom were teachers in Compton, California, where I taught, and we watched as our neighborhoods went up in smoke. I talked with one of my co-teachers who lived in South Hollywood, and he was watching out his window as a Korean grocer sat with a machine gun over his store, waving it at people who were coming up and threatening to throw bricks through his windows. It was a time that was really frightening for us. And it was a time that really challenged all the narratives that we'd grown up with about what our country was about how justice was served if you followed the rules. It challenged a lot of things for us. And I think for both my wife, Maria, and I, it cemented our desire to be involved in social justice in whatever job, whatever work we took on. I want to share a couple of other things that sort of in the wake of those things. The LA riots, the Rodney King uprisings, whatever, that's how we talked about it back then, lasted 5 days. The estimates that I read said that there was $1 billion in damage done in the wake of them. And the coverage that we saw was largely helicopter video of people running into stores empty-handed and running out of stores with hands full or shopping carts full. And so the dominant narrative coming out of there was that it was a lawless kind of an experience, and that it was easy, I think, for most people outside of LA to compartmentalize that experience as a paroxysm of crime as opposed to an expression of outrage. But I wanted to share with you guys things that probably never made the news. I was teaching in an inner city neighborhood where my kids, all of them experienced poverty. We were 100% free and reduced lunch at my school. And I can remember the first day back, I sat with my 5th graders in the back of the classroom. Only half of them were allowed to come to school because their parents kept them home. And we sat in a circle and we just shared about what our experience of the last 7 days had been like. And I can remember one little girl who was particularly vocal, talking about how wrong it was that all these people were going into the stores and taking shoes and taking things that didn't belong to them. And then one of the boys, who was wearing new shoes, looked over and he said, "Marisol, you're wearing new shoes too. I saw you in Payless shoes." And it struck me at that moment that the whole story hadn't been told in what the media was showing over and over again. The fact was that people went into those stores, but the fact also was that they were going and getting necessities. Marisol had never had shoes that fit her before that day. What I saw over and over again were people going in and out of into those stores and coming out of those stores with diapers, coming out with milk. Yeah, there were people coming out with TVs and furniture too, but what I saw really was an expression of deep need, that wasn't being fulfilled or that wasn't accessible for a lot of these families. And that really colored how I saw things as things went forward. I know that at the time, there were protests that started in San Francisco and Seattle and New York and Detroit, and those things were suppressed really, really strongly. And I can remember at the time thinking, you know, if this is the universe that we've created, maybe this isn't what needs to be. Maybe this is more of a problem than it is a solution. At any rate, so that was sort of that was early in my teaching career. I want to fast forward 27 years, 28 years. Last spring, we had shut down. We were all at home. I have 3 children, Emma, Sabina, and Larkin. My oldest, Emma, she was in her junior year at McAllister College, which is in St. Paul. And she was home. They had closed school and sent everybody home. And the George Floyd video came out. And I can remember the first day that came out, I didn't want to watch it. In fact, I don't think I did watch it the first day. Because I'd seen so many other things in the last year that were similar, and I didn't, you know, the prospect of watching another one was upsetting to me. But when the George Floyd video came out, within 24 hours of George Floyd's murder, things in Minneapolis and St. Paul blew up. And to me and to my wife, it looked a lot like what we'd experienced in LA. And only this time we were sitting on the couch because we're all COVID bound at home, and we're watching with our daughter and her boyfriend, who also went to the same school and was quarantining with us. We watched the places where they dated go up in flames, and watching the anguish and upset, both in terms of the social justice implications, but also in terms of their personal connections to the places that they were seeing on TV that were affected, was deeply upsetting for both of us. I think that we spent a lot of time. I can remember going to bed maybe the second night of watching those protests and some of the looting that went on and some of the peaceful protests that went on, thinking about whether anything had changed, despite the fact that both of us have given our lives to teaching. Well, my wife also to environmental social justice. Despite 20 odd years of work in those fields, had anything really improved? It was a really difficult quandary to face as a parent, to see the failure, or to perceive that there was a failure in our generation. I can remember in the wake of the LA riots feeling like my parents' generation and the generation before them had failed us, and then feeling that my own generation had failed my children was a pretty bad feeling. And then spending some real time wondering about it. I know that one of our biggest questions over the course of last summer was whether or not we wanted our kids, would allow our kids to go to the George Floyd protests that were happening around Seattle and Paulsbo. And, it sparked a lot of conversation because none of us were vaccinated. All of us were being really pretty diligent about keeping our distance, wearing masks, going out as little as possible. But all of us felt like the social justice needs of the times sort of dictated that we be participants. And in the end, we all opted to participate. We attended marches in Paulsbo and in Kingston, and I think my daughters did some other places. I'm not remembering clearly where they went, but I know that they were involved. And that felt like a necessity, I think, for all of us. So I guess in the interim, we've had almost a year since those times. And I've been sitting with this question: has anything changed? Did anything improve between the time when we had the video of Rodney King beaten by police officers who were exonerated at the end of the process, to the time when George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin, and we saw the whole thing, and was anything going to change? Well, my daughter finished her senior year and graduated this spring. And when we knew that the verdicts were going to come out in the Derek Chauvin trial, I called her and I said, look, honey, I don't have a lot of faith that that we're going to see anything that looks like justice come out of this trial. And I'm frightened. I'm frightened for you. And I want you to have an escape route. Find somebody with a car, find a place you want to go. If the verdicts come out the way I think they might, I'd really, really like to know that you're safe. And I don't think there's going to be a lot of social justice that happens immediately after, in the wake of the verdicts. The time to act is going to be after people have exercised their frustration and outrage. And I think she gave me the telephone equivalent of a pat on the head and said, Dad, I'll be fine. And that wasn't very reassuring. But I must say that I was, when the verdicts came out and the verdicts were guilty on all charges, that was very heartening to me. That made me think that some things had changed. So let's explore the differences. I want to talk just briefly about, I'm trying to keep an eye on the time. If someone can give me a message about what kind of time I have, I don't want to run over. A couple of things that I noticed were major differences. One is the way that the media talked about the two events. Back in the 90s, everything was about looting. It was looting and riots. And for the last year, what we've heard about is protests and the Derek Chauvin trial. I think that's a really big shift. Looting and riots places the emphasis on the criminality of the anger and the expression of the anger, whereas protests places the emphasis on the social injustice that we witnessed, and reminds us over and over and over again that people were taking to the streets and thousands of people were being arrested because there was an injustice. I think that's a big shift. I think that the way we name things makes a difference. Does anybody remember the name Stacy Kuhn or Timothy Wind? I'm seeing a few shaking heads. I threw those names past people who I knew in LA back in the 1990s. I threw those names past my parents who pay attention to political events all over the world and in the country. I even asked my wife, and nobody remembered those names, but those were the 4 police officers who were charged with the beating of Rodney King. We don't remember them. We remember the injustice to a degree. We remember the injustice that they perpetrated on Rodney King, but we don't remember them. I don't think we're going to forget Derek Chauvin, both because he was found guilty, but also because we saw his face over and over and over again. And it was reported on that he was the guy who was responsible for the injustice. I talked with one other person who was younger than me the other day. I was with my 8th graders out at the coast, and one of the moms, who's in her late 30s, said, I'd like to share with you, Nat, what my recollection of Rodney King was. And I said, well, what was it? And she shared that she remembered hearing his name in the news throughout the early 2000s, and that what she heard every single time was the association with the LA uprisings and his most recent brush with the law or indiscretion. So even when they covered him in his later years, what they covered was the fact that there was a re-emphasis that he was a criminal and that that there was something wrong with him. And so that sort of justified people being exonerated for, beating him and perpetrating injustice on him. Whereas I think that was attempted with George Floyd. I don't think it was nearly as successful. And I think that's a real step in the right direction. The other step in the right direction is that is the verdict. You know, in 1992, we were told by the courts essentially, don't believe what you see. And I think what we were told this time in the Derek Chauvin trial is that we can believe our eyes. We can believe what we saw, as horrible as it was. I also want to talk about one other thing, and that's the scale and duration of the public outrage. Back in 92, there were 5 days of unrest in LA. And then there was a lot, then the healing was, well, I don't know how much healing happened, but I can remember it was about a year later that the great LA cleanup happened. And there was a lot of emphasis in amongst the social justice movements down there to jump in and help. And, but I don't remember a lot of protests. I don't remember those covered. I don't remember those happening. The George Floyd protests went on from May, when the initial murder happened, all the way through November. The range and scale were incredible. Doing a little bit of research, rallies were hosted in all 50 states. There were more than 2,000 separate cities in the United States who held rallies of more than 100 people. 60 different countries joined in and held rallies in support of Black Lives Matter and in memory of George Floyd. They said that in the US, between 15 and 26 million people participated. That's a huge, huge number. It's like 8% of our population turned out. So in these ways, I think that things have gotten better. So going back to that question, does the arc of the moral universe bend toward justice? Maybe it does. I guess it somewhat passes the eyeball test. But the big question in my mind is, are we good yet? And the answer to that, my activist daughters would say, is no, not enough has happened, not by a long shot, Dad. And I think they're right. Currently, there are bills in over 40 states to restrict voting rights. And those bills that restrict voting rights primarily affect people of color, affect communities that are diverse and underrepresented. Black, Indigenous, people of color in the US face systematic disadvantages. And one of the things that, it's easy to be outraged, I guess, at the videotape of George Floyd being choked to death for 9 minutes. But it's really, I guess we should also be moved to action just as swiftly by the pervasive and well-documented and less visible injustices that underpin things like the healthcare gap, the education gap, the wealth gap, the achievement gap. These are all injustices that exist all around us, and we hear about them regularly. And so I guess the message that I want to bring forward today is the second of the two ethics that I wanted to talk about with you guys, and that is an ethic of action. I think we need to cultivate an ethic of action. That is, to cultivate a frame of mind that obliges us to act whenever we perceive injustice. To recognize that though we might believe what Theodore Parker and Martin Luther King said, that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, I think we also need to realize that arc of the moral universe, that what bends it is not its own weight, but it's our weight when we throw it behind anything that fights injustice. It's the pressure that we apply. Where am I here? Let me check my time. I think I'm probably pretty close to out of time. At any rate, I guess that's my big encouragement. The two ethics that I originally wanted to set out to talk about and ended up in a different place were to be able to say yes as adults to new learning. And I think from talking with Amy and also noticing my familiar faces, Claudia and Jane and John and oh gosh, who else was up there? Susan and Mary. I know that a lot of you guys already do this, that you're open learners and that you're an accepting community and that you're open to all kinds of new learning. I don't know your community well enough to know how that translates into action. And so I don't know if my message is well targeted. I don't know what you need. I think I knew what I wanted to say. And so I hope that fits. I hope that fits. I hope you leave a little bit uncomfortable, because I think that discomfort is one of our prods to action. And I really want to encourage all of you to, as you see injustice in our society, in all of its forms, feel obliged to act, feel obliged to do something about it, feel obliged to make things better, because I think the idea of having to wait for justice to sort itself out, as opposed to us putting our finger on the scale and going, no, we need to move things in the right direction more quickly. We need to challenge the idea that culture is a slow moving ship that can't change quickly. I think there've been, the George Floyd protests taught me, I guess, maybe that now with people so connected. Oh, I should underscore this one other thing that turned up in my research, and that is that well over 90, I think it was 95% of the protests that happened in support of George Floyd were entirely peaceful. Entirely peaceful. That tells me that people are organizing, and that they're organizing quickly, and that message gets out. And if we're not already a part of it, all of us need to be a part of that. So I guess that wraps up my time, and thank you so much for the opportunity to address you. And I'm grateful. Thank you.